How does a man go from a father of three to a prisoner of war in a foreign land? Artem Antonov, born in the quiet Siberian region of Novosibirsk, was once just another man striving to provide for his family. He had a wife who believed in him, 3 children who looked up to him, and a future that seemed steady, if not extraordinary. But choices define a life and has led him far from home, across borders, into battlefields, and ultimately into captivity. Artem's journey was not one of heroism, but of compulsion. Orders followed, and moral lines crossed. His path, shrouded in claims of duty and necessity, was one paved with the destruction of lives and communities, leaving a trail of suffering in its wake. This is the story of an occupier, a soldier, and a villain in an unjust war, a man whose actions reshaped not only his fate but the lives of countless others caught in the chaos. It's a story that forces us to confront the devastating choices made by those who claim they had no other option, and the irreparable scars left behind, when humanity is traded for obedience. Artem Antonov's tale is a mirror to a larger tragedy, reflecting the cost of complicity in the machinery of war. Artem Antonov was 29 years old when he found himself sitting in a cold prison cell, far from the comfort of his home in Novosibirsk, a region known for its icy winters and sprawling landscapes. A husband and father of 3, Artem had always seen himself as an ordinary man, someone just trying to get by. His wife relied on him, his children needed him, and his life seemed firmly rooted in the rhythm of family and work. Before the war, Artem's days were filled with the unremarkable yet vital routines of daily life. But beneath this facade of normalcy, a growing sense of financial strain pushed him toward a decision that would change everything. The promise of stability, the lure of a steady paycheck, and the prestige of serving under the banner of his country led him to enlist as a contract soldier. At first, it seemed like a pragmatic choice, a way to support his family and provide opportunities for his children that he never had. Artem was deployed with his unit to Ukraine under orders that framed the mission as an act of liberation. Official propaganda promised the soldiers that they were protectors, sent to defend and restore order in regions torn by conflict. But the reality on the ground was starkly different. What awaited Artem was not the righteous cause he was led to believe, but the grim reality of occupation, destruction, and loss. Captured in September after months of serving as a driver in contested zones, Artem was thrust into a reality he could no longer escape. He had crossed borders, delivered supplies, and transported the wounded and the dead in a war that had spiraled far beyond anything he could have imagined. His capture was not just the end of his role as a soldier, but the beginning of a reckoning, a moment when the story he told himself began to unravel against the harsh questions of his captors. Now, in captivity, Artem's life is dissected not just by his captors, but by the broader reality of the conflict itself. His narrative of duty and necessity faces the cold truth of lives shattered, families torn apart, and communities destroyed by the very war he had been a part of. It is here, in the stark confines of his cell, that the man who once saw himself as a provider must confront the devastating impact of his choices. The war in Ukraine began as a calculated invasion, shrouded in propaganda and framed as a special military operation meant to liberate and protect. But what unfolded was a conflict of devastating proportions, a brutal occupation marked by indiscriminate shelling, widespread destruction, and untold suffering for civilians caught in the crossfire. Towns once filled with life became graveyards of shattered homes and dreams, as advancing forces left a trail of devastation in their wake. Artem Antonov was one of thousands sent to enforce this invasion, a cog in the massive machinery of war. His role, though seemingly mundane as a driver, was pivotal in its own grim way. He transported supplies to the front lines, carried the wounded to makeshift medical facilities, and returned with the dead, the 200s, the lifeless remnants of the campaign. He often justified his actions as orders, unquestionable and absolute, yet each mission etched deeper scars into the lives of those affected by his compliance. The moral weight of Artem's role is impossible to ignore. By following orders, he became a participant in atrocities, an accomplice to the destruction of homes, the displacement of families, and the deaths of the innocent. As Ukrainian forces pushed back, stories of war crimes began to surface, casting a harsh light on the actions of soldiers like Artem. He claimed to be just a driver, yet every trip he took enabled a larger system that thrived on violence and control. Now, as a prisoner of war, Artem's story raises profound questions. How does an individual reconcile their role in an unjust invasion? Can obedience to authority ever excuse the choices made on the battlefield? And what is the cost, not just to Artem himself, but to the countless lives his actions touched? These questions linger in the air as Artem's life serves as both a cautionary tale and a mirror to the moral collapse inherent in war. Artem Antonov's story, as told by him, is one of reluctance and circumstance. He paints himself as a simple man caught in forces far beyond his control. A driver, nothing more. Someone who never fired a weapon, never sought violence, and never wanted to be a soldier in the first place. To hear Artem tell it, he is almost a bystander in his own war, swept up by the tides of history and left with no choice but to follow orders. "I'm just a driver," he would repeat during his interviews, as if the phrase could absolve him of the weight of his actions. He transported supplies, moved the wounded, and carried the dead. These were not acts of aggression, he would argue, but duties, necessary and detached from the moral consequences of the larger war. "I didn't even carry a rifle most of the time," he claimed, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. For Artem, this distinction between active combat and logistical support seemed critical, as if it placed a moral barrier between him and the atrocities he indirectly facilitated. Artem also leaned heavily on the argument of necessity. "I had no other choice," he said, describing a life bound by economic hardship and the pressure to provide for his family. With 3 children at home and few opportunities in Novosibirsk, the steady paycheck of a contract soldier seemed like the only option. "I did it for my kids," he explained, framing his decision to enlist as an act of sacrifice rather than ambition. In his mind, the war was not his war. It was something imposed upon him, a burden he carried for the sake of survival. Throughout his narrative, Artem repeatedly distanced himself from the violence. He described his time on the front lines as mundane and procedural. Days spent driving through bombed-out roads, nights spent trying to block out the distant sounds of artillery. To him, the war was not about ideology or conquest. It was simply a job. "I didn't want this," he would insist, as though wanting less than the reality of his participation. But Artem's story of reluctant complicity raises its own questions. Can claiming innocence truly excuse actions that enable destruction? Does transporting the instruments of war make one any less culpable than those who wield them? As he tells his story, it becomes clear that Artem's self-portrayal is not just a defense. It is a fragile narrative, built to shield himself from the truth of what he has been a part of. And as that narrative unravels, so too does the illusion of his innocence. As Artem Antonov recounted his story, the interviewer listened carefully, probing deeper into the contradictions that lay beneath his claims of innocence. The cracks in his narrative were stark, and each question unraveled another thread of his carefully constructed self-portrayal. Artem claimed to be just a driver, but the truth, as revealed in the details of his own account, painted a far more damning picture. "You say you were a driver," the interviewer began, their voice calm but pressing. "Yet you transported bodies, both the living and the dead. Do you not think that makes you part of this war, part of the machine that perpetuates this destruction?" Artem hesitated, his gaze faltering. "I didn't kill anyone. I only did what I was told," he replied, his tone defensive. But the interviewer pressed further. "And what about the day you drove 5 bodies, 200s, as you call them, charred from an ambush? You said yourself that you and your comrades used bottles of drinking water to douse the flames, that one man was still crawling on his knees, burning. How do you reconcile that with your claim of innocence?" For a moment, Artem was silent, as if replaying the scene in his mind. "I had no choice. It was my job," he finally said, his voice barely audible. But the interviewer wasn't satisfied. No choice? Or was it easier to not question the orders, to keep your head down and tell yourself you were just a cog in the machine? The conversation turned to Artem's awareness of the brutality around him. He had seen the aftermath of artillery strikes, the bodies of civilians sprawled in the rubble of their homes, the terrified faces of those fleeing the advancing forces. Yet, he had continued to follow orders, transporting soldiers and equipment deeper into Ukrainian territory. When you crossed the border on February 24th, the interviewer asked, "Did you believe you were liberating anyone? Did you question why you were driving through cities that were clearly not welcoming you?" Artem shook his head. "They told us we were there to protect people, to bring stability to the region," he said. The interviewer's response was sharp. "And did it look like protection when you saw villages burned to the ground? When you saw children orphaned and their parents killed? Did you ever ask yourself what you were really doing there?" Artem's silence spoke louder than any denial. The interviewer continued to push, their questions cutting through the thin veil of his justifications. "You say you didn't want to fight, yet You took orders without question. When your commanders told you to transport soldiers into combat zones, to carry the wounded and the dead, did you ever refuse? Did you ever think about the families of those whose lives you were helping to destroy? I couldn't refuse, Artem muttered. You don't understand how it works. Oh, I understand perfectly, the interviewer shot back. You chose to follow orders, knowing full well what those orders meant. You weren't ignorant, Artem. You were complicit. The tension in the room was palpable as the interviewer's words hung in the air. Artem's claims of innocence crumbled under the weight of the evidence he had unwittingly provided. His role as a driver was not a shield but a window into the larger machinery of war, a machinery that he had fueled with every trip he made and every order he followed. The reality was clear. Artem was no mere bystander. He was an active participant in an invasion that left countless lives shattered. As Artem Antonov recounted his story, the interviewer listened carefully, probing deeper into the contradictions that lay beneath his claims of innocence. The cracks in his narrative were stark, and each question unraveled another thread of his carefully constructed self-portrayal. Artem claimed to be just a driver, but the truth, as revealed in the details of his own account, painted a far more damning picture. You say you were a driver, the interviewer began, their voice calm but pressing. Yet you transported bodies, both the living and the dead. Do you not think that makes you part of this war, part of the machine that perpetuates this destruction? Artem hesitated, his gaze faltering. I didn't kill anyone. I only did what I was told, he replied, his tone defensive. But the interviewer pressed further. And what about the day you drove 5 bodies, 200s, as you call them, charred from an ambush? You said yourself that you and your comrades used bottles of drinking water to douse the flames, that one man was still crawling on his knees, burning. How do you reconcile that with your claim of innocence? For a moment, Artem was silent, as if replaying the scene in his mind. I had no choice. It was my job, he finally said, his voice barely audible. But the interviewer wasn't satisfied. No choice? Or was it easier to not question the orders, to keep your head down and tell yourself you were just a cog in the machine? The conversation turned to Artem's awareness of the brutality around him. He had seen the aftermath of artillery strikes, the bodies of civilians sprawled in the rubble of their homes, the terrified faces of those fleeing the advancing forces. Yet, he had continued to follow orders, transporting soldiers and equipment deeper into Ukrainian territory. When you crossed the border on February 24th, the interviewer asked, did you believe you were liberating anyone? Did you question why you were driving through cities that were clearly not welcoming you? Artem shook his head. They told us we were there to protect people, to bring stability to the region, he said. The interviewer's response was sharp. And did it look like protection when you saw villages burned to the ground? When you saw children orphaned and their parents killed? Did you ever ask yourself what you were really doing there? Artem's silence spoke louder than any denial. The interviewer continued to push, their questions cutting through the thin veil of his justifications. You say you didn't want to fight. Yet, you took orders without question. When your commanders told you to transport soldiers into combat zones, to carry the wounded and the dead, did you ever refuse? Did you ever think about the families of those whose lives you were helping to destroy? I couldn't refuse, Artem muttered. You don't understand how it works. Oh, I understand perfectly, the interviewer shot back. You chose to follow orders, knowing full well what those orders meant. You weren't ignorant, Artem. You were complicit. The tension in the room was palpable as the interviewer's words hung in the air. Artem's claims of innocence crumbled under the weight of the evidence he had unwittingly provided. His role as a driver was not a shield but a window into the larger machinery of war, a machinery that he had fueled with every trip he made and every order he followed. The reality was clear. Artem was no mere bystander. He was an active participant in an invasion that left countless lives shattered. Artem Antonov's story took a deeply personal turn when he spoke of his wife and children. His voice softened as he described their lives back home in Novosibirsk, a modest home filled with laughter, the bustling chaos of 3 young children, and the quiet determination of a wife who held their family together. For Artem, they were the reason behind his decision to enlist, and in his mind, the justification for everything he had done. My wife supported me, he said during his interview, his tone tinged with regret. She knew we needed the money. Life was hard, and this was my chance to give my kids something better. The promise of financial stability was undeniable. Artem explained how his military contract paid nearly 3 times what he could earn in civilian work. It was enough to cover their bills, provide a future for their children, and perhaps even buy a few luxuries they could never otherwise afford. I sent most of my paycheck home. he said. For my family. For my kids. That's what mattered. His wife, too, had rationalized his role in the war. In their phone calls, she would assure him that he was doing the right thing. She told me I was protecting our country, Artem recalled. She believed in what they said, that we were helping people, keeping them safe. But the reality of the war starkly contrasted with the narrative he clung to. The money Artem sent home came at a cost that could never be quantified. For every paycheck deposited into his family's account, there was a village leveled, a family displaced, a life destroyed. The suffering caused by his actions was not abstract. It was visceral, visible in the faces of those he saw fleeing their homes, in the burned-out remnants of schools and hospitals, and in the lifeless bodies he transported. The interviewer confronted Artem with this painful dichotomy. You say you did this for your children, they began. But what about the children whose lives were shattered by your convoys? What about the mothers who will never see their sons again because of the war you helped sustain? Artem's voice faltered. I never wanted that, he said. I didn't want any of this. But you allowed it to happen. The interviewer pressed. You took the money, followed the orders, and told yourself it was all for your family. Did you ever stop to think about the families on the other side of this war? The question hung heavy in the air. Artem's financial motivations and his wife's reassurances had offered him a veneer of justification, but they could not erase the suffering his actions had enabled. His children might one day ask him why he did what he did, and he might struggle to find an answer. The truth, stark and unrelenting, was that his attempt to secure a better life for his family had come at the expense of countless others. The war he claimed not to want had made him a villain in the eyes of those whose lives it destroyed. Artem Antonov's journey through the battlefront was a descent into chaos that he could never have anticipated. Sent first to Kharkiv and later to Donetsk, he found himself moving through landscapes transformed by war, fields turned to cratered wastelands, towns reduced to rubble, and skies filled with the constant drone of artillery. For Artem, the battlefront was both a job and a nightmare, a place where fear and survival became his only constants. It was nothing like what they told us, Artem admitted, his voice trembling as he recounted the early days. We were supposed to be welcomed, but instead, we were met with resistance at every turn. In Kharkiv, Artem's convoy came under its first major attack. He was driving a supply truck loaded with ammunition and rations when the column was ambushed. The sound of gunfire erupted without warning, a deafening cacophony that sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. Explosions tore through the air as Ukrainian forces targeted the lead vehicles. The first truck just disappeared, Artem said, describing how it was obliterated by a direct hit from an anti-tank missile. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. As panic spread through the convoy, Artem gripped the wheel, his hands slick with sweat. His commanding officer barked orders over the radio, but the words were drowned out by the chaos around them. Soldiers scrambled for cover, some firing blindly into the trees lining the road. Artem saw one of his comrades, barely older than a teenager, fall to the ground clutching his leg, blood pooling beneath him. I wanted to stop and help, Artem said, his voice breaking, but they told us to keep moving, to get the supplies through at any cost. Moments like these became routine as the weeks turned into months. In Donetsk, Artem's unit faced relentless shelling as they tried to hold their positions. He spoke of nights spent huddled in makeshift shelters, the ground shaking with each impact, and the air thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and flesh. You don't sleep out there, he said. You just wait for it to stop. The turning point came during a mission to transport wounded soldiers back to a medical outpost. Artem's convoy was ambushed again, this time in a narrow valley outside Sloviansk. The enemy was prepared, waiting with machine guns and RPGs. As bullets ricocheted off the armored vehicles, Artem's instincts took over. He veered off the road, trying to avoid a mortar strike that had landed just meters ahead. The truck behind him wasn't so lucky. I looked in the mirror and saw it go up in flames, he recounted. I could hear them screaming, but there was nothing I could do. Artem's truck was hit next, the force of the explosion throwing him against the dashboard. Disoriented and bleeding from a gash on his forehead, he scrambled to escape the vehicle. I thought I was going to die, he said. I just ran. I didn't even know where I was going. I just ran. For 3 days, Artem wandered through the forest, surviving on berries and rainwater, evading both his enemies and his own forces. I thought about surrendering, he admitted. But I was afraid of what they'd do to me, and afraid of what my own commanders would say if they found out I'd given up. The ambush marked the beginning of the end for Artem. By the time he was captured, he was a shadow of the man who had crossed the border months earlier. The fear, the chaos, and the relentless violence had stripped him of any illusions he once held about the war. It wasn't liberation, and it wasn't glory. It was survival, and it came at a cost he could no longer bear. Artem Antonov's role as a driver placed him at the crossroads of life and death in the war. His vehicle became both a lifeline for the wounded and a grim transport for the dead. Known among soldiers by their chilling designations, 200S for the dead and 300S for the wounded, these were the passengers Artem carried day after day, an unrelenting reminder of the brutal toll of war. "It was my job," Artem said quietly, as though repeating the phrase could dull the memories. But no words could erase the images burned into his mind. After every battle, his orders were clear: gather the fallen, load them onto his truck, and transport them away from the front lines. "At first, I tried not to look," he admitted, "but it was impossible not to see." One of his most haunting missions came after an ambush in the Donetsk region. Artem was called to retrieve the remains of soldiers caught in the attack. The battlefield was a scene of utter devastation. Vehicles reduced to charred husks, the air thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The bodies were scattered across the ground, some burned beyond recognition, others twisted into unnatural shapes by the force of explosions. "I remember one man," Artem recounted, his voice trembling. "He had been thrown from the vehicle. His uniform was still smoldering when we arrived. His body was so badly burned that his arms were fused to his chest. We had to pry him loose from the ground. The task of loading the 200S fell to Artem and a handful of other soldiers. They worked in grim silence, their faces pale as they used whatever they could find: blankets, tarps, their own jackets, to lift the remains. The smell was the worst," Artem said. "You never forget the smell of burned flesh. It clings to you no matter how much you wash." Then there were the 300S, the wounded, whose cries of pain filled the air as Artem and his comrades worked to load them onto the truck. Some were missing limbs, hastily bandaged stumps still seeping blood. Others stared blankly, their faces pale and slick with sweat, caught somewhere between shock and agony. "One man kept begging me to save his leg," Artem said, "but there was nothing I could do. He died before we even made it to the medical station." Artem spoke of the strange rituals soldiers developed to cope with the horror. Some joked as they worked, their dark humor a fragile shield against the weight of their task. Others turned stoic, their faces blank as they carried body after body. Artem himself fell somewhere in between, haunted but detached, focused only on completing the job so he could leave the scene behind. But the memories followed him, no matter how far he drove. The faces of the dead haunted his dreams, their screams echoing in his mind long after the sounds of the battlefield had faded. "It changes you," he said. "You see things no one should ever have to see. You do things no one should ever have to do." For Artem, the grim task of transporting the dead and wounded was more than just a job. It was a daily confrontation with the cost of the war. Every body he loaded onto his truck, every soldier who drew their last breath in the back of his vehicle, was a reminder of the fragility of life and the devastation wrought by the invasion. And as he drove away from each battlefield, leaving behind a trail of destruction, Artem was left to grapple with the role he played in perpetuating the cycle of death and suffering. Artem Antonov's final mission began like so many others: a hasty order, a vehicle barely functional from months of abuse, and the grim task of loading the wounded for transport. But this time, there was an unease in the air, a tension that hung heavy over the convoy. Artem didn't know it yet, but this mission would mark the end of his journey as a soldier, and the beginning of his reckoning. The order came late in the day. Drive to a makeshift triage center near the contested village of Makiyivka and evacuate the wounded to a field hospital further north. The mission was urgent. Reports indicated that Ukrainian forces were closing in on their position. "We were told to be quick," Artem recalled. "Get in, load up, and leave before they got too close." Artem arrived at the triage center to find chaos. Soldiers lay on stretchers and on the ground, some moaning in pain, others eerily silent. Medics worked frantically, their hands slick with blood, as they tried to stabilize the worst cases. Artem's truck was soon filled to capacity. The 300S were stacked wherever they could fit. On the floor, against the walls, even on top of one another. The faint groans of the injured and the sharp cries of agony echoed through the cabin as Artem climbed into the driver's seat. The journey started uneventfully, the convoy moving cautiously through the winding dirt roads that snaked through the countryside. Artem's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes darting to the side mirrors as he scanned for signs of danger. The radio crackled with fragmented updates, the voices tense. "Stay alert," came a voice, barely audible over the static. "We've had reports of enemy movement nearby. It wasn't long before the convoy hit trouble. As they approached a crossroads, a deafening explosion rocked the lead vehicle. Artem slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding as he saw the plume of smoke rising ahead. Shouts erupted over the radio, orders shouted and contradicted in the chaos. "Ambush!" Someone screamed, the word sending a jolt of fear through Artem's body. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks of rifles and the heavy thud of machine guns filling the air. Artem's truck shuddered as bullets ricocheted off its armored sides. The wounded in the back cried out, their voices blending into a cacophony of terror. Artem's instincts kicked in, and he swerved off the road, trying to avoid the wreckage of the lead vehicle. "I didn't know where I was going," Artem admitted. "I just drove. The road didn't matter anymore. I just wanted to get away." But escape wasn't in the cards. As Artem's truck barreled through the uneven terrain, another explosion ripped through the air. The blast caught the vehicle's rear, sending it careening sideways. Artem was thrown against the door, his head slamming into the window as the truck skidded to a halt. Disoriented and bleeding, Artem stumbled out of the cab, the sounds of battle still raging around him. He saw his comrades falling, one by one, their silhouettes illuminated by the flickering light of distant fires. He froze for a moment, unsure whether to fight, run, or surrender. But before he could make a decision, a voice shouted in Ukrainian, "Drop your weapon." Hands in the air, Artem turned to see several figures emerging from the shadows, their rifles trained on him. He raised his hands slowly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In that moment, the weight of months of war, of every decision and every order, came crashing down on him. The war was over for Artem, but the reckoning was just beginning. As the soldiers approached, one of them tied Artem's hands behind his back and led him away. His mind raced as he was marched into the night, his ears still ringing from the ambush. The convoy was gone, the wounded left behind in the wreckage. All that remained was Artem, a prisoner of war, a man caught between the choices he made and the consequences he could no longer escape. Artem Antonov's capture was a moment he would relive countless times, each detail seared into his memory. The ambush came suddenly, a coordinated strike that left his convoy in disarray and his world upended. Artem had been at the wheel, focused on the road ahead, when the first explosion erupted. The lead vehicle was blown apart, a ball of fire and debris that lit up the night. "Hold position," crackled the radio, but the command was drowned out by the escalating chaos. Gunfire rained down from both sides of the narrow road, the sharp cracks of rifles mingling with the heavy thuds of mortar rounds. Artem's truck lurched as bullets ricocheted off its sides, the injured in the back crying out in fear and pain. Panic surged through him. He slammed the accelerator, trying to maneuver the truck off the road and away from the kill zone. But the terrain was unforgiving, and the vehicle skidded to a halt as another explosion rocked the convoy. Artem was thrown forward, his head striking the steering wheel, leaving him dazed and bleeding. As he stumbled out of the cab, the scene before him was one of utter devastation. Trucks and armored vehicles were burning, their silhouettes flickering against the dark sky. The groans of the wounded mingled with the distant shouts of Ukrainian soldiers advancing through the chaos. Artem's comrades were scattered, some firing blindly, others fleeing into the night. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead, rooted to the ground in a mix of shock and fear. It was then that he heard the command, clear and sharp over the noise of battle. "Drop your weapon. Hands where we can see them." Artem turned, his heart pounding, to see several Ukrainian soldiers emerging from the shadows. Their rifles were trained on him, their faces hardened by months of war. Artem hesitated, his mind racing. He had no weapon to drop. His role had been to drive, not to fight. Slowly he raised his hands, his fingers trembling. "I'm not armed," he shouted in broken Ukrainian, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm just a driver." The soldiers closed in, their movements swift and precise. One of them shoved him to his knees while another tied his hands behind his back with rough cord. Artem flinched as the cords bit into his wrists, his mind consumed by a singular primal fear: survival. He was dragged to his feet, his captors barking questions at him, their words a rapid-fire barrage that he struggled to process. "Why are you here? What were you transporting? Who gave the orders?" The questions came, each one punctuated by the glare of a flashlight in his eyes. Artem stammered, his words tumbling over one another in a frantic attempt to explain. "I didn't want this. I had no choice. I'm just following orders." The soldiers exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. "No choice when you crossed our border. You had a choice when you crossed our border. You had a choice when you helped kill our people." Artem's pleas became more desperate. "I didn't shoot anyone. I swear, I didn't even carry a weapon. I only drove supplies, moved the wounded, and the dead. Another soldier interrupted coldly. You moved the dead too, didn't you? Do you think that makes you innocent? The weight of their words pressed down on him, suffocating in its clarity. They weren't just questioning his actions. They were questioning the core of the justification he had clung to throughout the war. The moral distance he had tried to maintain between himself and the violence around him was collapsing under their scrutiny. As the soldiers led him away, Artem's fear reached a fever pitch. Would they kill him on the spot? Would they treat him as an enemy combatant or show him the same mercy he had denied others through his complicity? His thoughts spiraled, alternating between self-pity and the cold realization of what he had become. In those first hours of captivity, Artem Antonov's story began to shift. No longer was he the driver claiming innocence. He was now a prisoner of war, forced to confront the reality of his actions under the unflinching gaze of those whose lives had been forever altered by his presence. And for the first time, there was no escape, no convoy to drive, no orders to follow. Only the reckoning. Artem Antonov's first days in captivity were a blur of fear, confusion, and the suffocating weight of uncertainty. The transition from soldier to prisoner was immediate and brutal, stripping away any illusion of control he had clung to during the war. Bound, blindfolded, and thrown into the back of a military vehicle, Artem was transported to an unknown location. The dark ride punctuated only by the muffled voices of his captors and the occasional jolt of the vehicle over rough terrain. When the blindfold was finally removed, he found himself in a small, dimly lit room with concrete walls and a single chair bolted to the floor. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a cold, clinical glow on the interrogation table in front of him. His hands were still tied, and his wrists throbbed from the cord's tightness. Exhaustion weighed on him, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him alert, his senses heightened by fear. The first interrogator entered the room with deliberate slowness, a clipboard in one hand and a stern expression etched onto his face. Artem's heart raced as the man sat across from him, his piercing gaze unrelenting. The questions began almost immediately, delivered in calm but commanding tones. Name? The interrogator asked. Artem Antonov, he replied, his voice shaky. Rank and unit? I'm just a driver, Artem stammered. I wasn't a fighter. I didn't hurt anyone. The interrogator didn't react to his protest, instead flipping through the clipboard with measured precision. You crossed the border on February 24th, correct? With the 42nd Motorized Infantry Brigade? Yes, Artem admitted reluctantly. But I didn't fire a weapon. I was assigned to logistics, just transporting supplies and the wounded. The interrogator leaned forward, his voice sharp. And the dead. Don't forget about them. How many 200Ss did you carry, Artem? How many lives did you deliver to their final resting place? Artem faltered, his throat dry. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The interrogator seized on his hesitation. Do you think moving bodies absolves you of guilt? Every trip you made, every convoy you drove, was part of this invasion. Did you think we wouldn't notice? I had no choice, Artem blurted out, his voice trembling. They ordered me to do it. If I refused, the interrogator cut him off. You had a choice every step of the way. You could have said no, walked away, even surrendered. But you didn't. You followed orders, knowing full well what they meant for our people. The room fell silent, the weight of the interrogator's words pressing down on Artem. He tried to justify himself again, speaking quickly, almost incoherently. I have a family, 3 kids. I only joined to support them. I didn't want to fight. I didn't even carry a rifle most of the time. Do you think your family justifies what you've done here? The interrogator snapped. Do you think the mothers and fathers of the people you helped kill would care about your excuses? Do you think their children are any less valuable than yours? The questions cut deep, each one dismantling the fragile narrative Artem had constructed to protect himself from the truth. His protests grew weaker with each passing hour, his voice faltering under the relentless barrage. The interrogators worked in shifts, their methods alternating between calm reasoning and pointed accusations. They asked about specific missions, pressed him on names of commanders, and demanded details about the routes he had taken. Each question exposed another layer of his complicity, leaving him increasingly unable to defend himself. The psychological toll of captivity began to take hold. Sleep was sporadic and restless, interrupted by the cold echo of footsteps outside his cell or the clanging of doors down the hall. Artem found himself replaying the events of the past months over and over in his mind, each memory a jagged shard that cut deeper into his conscience. He tried to focus on his family, on the hope of seeing them again, But even those thoughts were tainted by the realization of what they might think if they knew the full truth. By the end of the first few days, Artem was no longer sure of who he was: father, soldier, driver, or villain. His identity had been stripped down to its barest components, each one weighed and judged by his captors. And as the interrogations continued, he was forced to confront a truth he could no longer deny. He had not simply been a participant in the war. He had been an enabler of its horrors. The man who had once seen himself as a provider now saw the blood-stained path that had brought him to this room, a path paved with choices he could no longer justify. Artem Antonov sat alone in his cell, the cold, unyielding walls pressing in around him. The adrenaline of survival had faded, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that refused to let him rest. He had once told himself he was a driver, just a cog in a machine too vast to resist. But now, in the silence of captivity, that story no longer comforted him. The evidence his interrogators had laid before him painted a starkly different picture, one he couldn't escape. The first crack in his defenses came during an interrogation when they presented the details of his convoy routes: towns flattened, lives uprooted. "Do you recognize these locations?" the interrogator asked, pushing a map toward him. Artem hesitated, staring at the circles drawn around names he vaguely remembered. Mariupol, Izium, Kharkiv. He nodded reluctantly. "These are the places your unit passed through," the interrogator continued. "Do you remember what you saw? Homes destroyed, civilians fleeing? Or did you keep your eyes forward, pretending not to notice?" Artem tried to respond, his voice faltering. I didn't have a choice. I just drove where they told me to." The interrogator's gaze didn't waver. "And when you loaded the wounded and the dead onto your truck, did you ever wonder who they were? Did you ever question why you were driving convoys into cities that no longer had hospitals, schools, or homes?" Artem's mind flashed back to those missions. The young soldier whose blood pooled at his feet as he begged to go home. The charred remains of a civilian car struck by artillery fire. The lifeless eyes of a child cradled by a grieving mother as she begged for help he couldn't give. He had seen it all, and yet he had told himself it wasn't his responsibility. "They didn't tell us everything," Artem muttered, his words weak and unconvincing. "I didn't know." The interrogator leaned closer, his voice sharp. "You didn't need to be told. You saw it with your own eyes. You heard the cries of people begging for their lives, and you kept driving. You want to blame your commanders, the orders, the war itself. But you made a choice every time you turned that key." Those words haunted Artem in the quiet hours. For months, he had justified his actions by clinging to the belief that he had no alternative. He told himself he was providing for his family, that he was powerless to change the course of the war. But now, confronted with the full weight of his actions, that justification began to crumble. He thought of his wife's voice on the phone, encouraging him to stay strong, reminding him that his children needed him. He had used their needs as a shield, convincing himself that the ends justified the means, but whose children had suffered because of his obedience, whose families had been destroyed by the convoys he drove, by the supplies and soldiers he delivered to the front lines. The interrogators continued to dismantle his defenses, presenting evidence of the destruction his unit had left behind. Photos of bombed-out buildings, lists of civilian casualties, reports of atrocities committed by soldiers he had transported. Each piece of evidence was a hammer blow to the fragile narrative he had built for himself. "You say you didn't fire a weapon," the interrogator said during one session, "but you didn't need to. Every load of ammunition you delivered, every truck of supplies you drove, enabled others to pull the trigger. Do you think that makes you any less responsible?" Artem couldn't answer. He had spent months telling himself he was innocent, that he was merely surviving. But the truth was unavoidable. His role in the war was not passive. It was active, complicit, and devastating in its consequences. As the days turned into nights and the interrogations continued, Artem began to confront a question he had long avoided. What kind of man had he become? He had once been a father, a provider, someone who saw himself as doing what was necessary to care for his family. But now, stripped of his excuses and forced to face the evidence of his actions, he saw the truth. He was not just a driver. He was a participant in a war that had destroyed countless lives, a man who had traded his morality for survival. In his cell, Artem began to cry, not for himself, but for the lives he had helped to shatter, for the families who would never know the comfort of reunion, and for the man he once believed he was. The reckoning was here, and it was merciless. For the first time, Artem Antonov was forced to confront the question he could no longer avoid: was his survival worth the cost of his humanity? Artem Antonov's first call home as a prisoner of war was one of the rare privileges granted to him, yet it quickly became one of the most excruciating experiences of his life. His captors led him to a small room with a phone mounted on the wall and a soldier standing guard by the door. The handset felt foreign in his hands, heavier than it should have been, as though it carried the weight of all the unsaid words he had been avoiding since the start of the war. The phone rang only twice before his wife picked up. "Artem?" Her voice was a mixture of relief and fear, trembling as she clung to the sound of him. "It's me," he replied, his voice cracking. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching between them like an unbridgeable chasm. "Where are you?" she finally asked, her voice hushed. "I'm alive," he said simply. "That's all I can say right now." Her relief was audible, a sharp intake of breath followed by a shaky exhale. "The kids, they've been asking about you. I told them you're doing your duty keeping us safe." Artem closed his eyes, the guilt clawing at him. He could picture their faces. His youngest, still too young to understand, and the older two idolized him as a protector and provider. The weight of their belief in him was unbearable. "How are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're okay," she said, but there was a hesitation in her tone. "Sasha got sick last week. I had to take him to the clinic, but we managed. He's better now." Artem swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. He had left them behind to fight in a war he barely believed in, all for a paycheck he thought would make their lives better. But what had it truly cost them? What had it cost him? "They gave me time to call," he said after a pause, trying to shift the focus. "I don't know when I'll be able to talk to you again." His wife's voice grew tense. "What are they doing to you, Artem? Are you safe?" "I'm fine," he lied, the words tasting bitter. He couldn't tell her about the interrogations, the accusations, the mounting evidence of his complicity. He couldn't tell her how he had started to question everything he had done, how he no longer recognized himself. "They said you'd come home soon," she said, her voice breaking. "They promised you'd come home." Her words stung, a painful reminder of the promises he had made to her and the children before leaving. He had told them he would return, that this was only temporary, that it was for their future. But now, standing on the other side of that promise, he wondered if he could ever truly come home. "I hope so," he replied, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The conversation turned to the children, their milestones and struggles, their innocence in the face of a war they could barely comprehend. Artem listened as she described their drawings, their schoolwork, their excitement whenever they thought of him. Each word was a knife, cutting deeper into the disconnect between the man he had become and the father they still believed in. At last, his wife's voice softened. "They miss you," she said. "They ask me when you'll be back. I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them." Artem paused, his breath hitching. "Tell them I love them, and tell them I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion. Artem couldn't answer. "Sorry for leaving? Sorry for the choices he made? Sorry for the lives he helped destroy?" The words wouldn't come, trapped behind the wall of his guilt and shame. When the call ended, Artem was left alone with the crushing realization of what he had sacrificed. He had told himself he was fighting for his family, for their future, but the war had taken him from them in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't the man they needed him to be, and now, as a prisoner of war, he wondered if he ever could be again. The cost of his decisions was immeasurable, not just in the lives lost on the battlefield, but in the distance he had created between himself and the people he loved most. And for the first time, Artem truly felt the weight of what he had done, not as a soldier, but as a father and a husband. Artem Antonov's journey was one of stark transformation, a man shaped by choices he thought were necessary but that ultimately unraveled everything he believed about himself. He began as a civilian in Novosibirsk, a father of 3 with modest ambitions and a determination to provide for his family. Life was difficult but manageable, and the allure of financial stability led him to enlist as a contract soldier. It was a decision he justified as a means to an end, a sacrifice for the ones he loved. But the war transformed him. As a soldier, Artem became part of a massive invasion force, his role as a driver placing him in the machinery of an unjust war. Each mission blurred the lines between survival and complicity, transporting supplies to the front lines, wounded soldiers to makeshift hospitals, and the dead away from the battlefields. He told himself he was merely following orders, that he had no choice, but with every convoy he drove, the weight of his actions grew heavier. He witnessed horrors that would haunt him forever, civilians displaced, towns leveled, comrades reduced to lifeless bodies in the aftermath of battle. Yet he kept moving forward, each mile taking him further from the man he once was. the man who had joined to protect his family, had become a participant in a war that destroyed countless others. Now, as a prisoner of war, Artem faced a reality he could no longer escape. Stripped of his uniform and his illusions, he was forced to confront the truth of his actions. The interrogations, the evidence, and the relentless questions had exposed the cracks in the narrative he had built to protect himself. No longer could he claim innocence or ignorance. He was complicit in atrocities that had shattered lives and communities. Artem's transformation was complete. From civilian to soldier, from soldier to prisoner, he had crossed boundaries he never thought he would. The war had not only captured his body, but also his conscience, leaving him to grapple with the irrevocable consequences of his choices. The man who once saw himself as a provider now stood as a symbol of the devastating cost of obedience in an unjust war. And in the silence of his cell, Artem was left with only one question. Could he ever atone for what he had become? Artem Antonov's story is not just the tale of one man. It is a microcosm of a war that has consumed thousands of lives, uprooted entire communities, and left scars that may never heal. His transformation from civilian to soldier to prisoner is emblematic of the countless individuals caught in the machinery of a conflict driven by power, propaganda, and control. It is a story of complicity, of choices made under pressure, and of the profound consequences those choices have on individuals and society. The war itself, framed as a liberation by those who orchestrated it, has been anything but. Entire towns and cities have been leveled, their residents forced to flee or live under occupation. Families have been torn apart, their lives shattered by a war they never wanted. The justification for this invasion, a narrative of protection and unity, has unraveled in the face of overwhelming evidence of brutality and destruction. Artem's role, though seemingly minor, is a stark reminder that every act, no matter how small, contributes to the greater machinery of violence. Artem's story also highlights the personal cost of participation in an unjust war. He enlisted to provide for his family, believing that financial stability could shield them from the hardships of life in Siberia. But his decision to become a soldier, even a reluctant one, has estranged him from the very people he sought to protect. His wife and children now bear the weight of his absence, their futures uncertain, while he sits in captivity, grappling with the moral and emotional toll of his actions. For those like Artem, the war offers no winners. Soldiers who carry out orders, believing they have no choice, are left to reckon with the aftermath. Broken families, shattered consciences, and lives forever marked by the horrors they enabled. Meanwhile, the victims of their actions, civilians whose homes, loved ones, and futures have been destroyed, are left to rebuild amidst the rubble of their lives. Artem's experience raises difficult questions. What drives people to participate in wars they don't believe in? How does propaganda turn ordinary individuals into instruments of destruction? And at what point does survival become complicity? His story serves as a stark reminder of the cost of unquestioning obedience and the devastating impact of collective violence. Beyond Artem's personal reckoning, his story reflects the broader consequences of the invasion. It underscores the human cost of decisions made by those in power, decisions that ripple through the lives of soldiers and civilians alike. It forces us to confront the moral weight of actions taken in the name of duty and survival, and to consider the long-term repercussions of wars fought for unjust causes. Artem Antonov's journey is a cautionary tale, a reflection of the choices individuals make under pressure, the narratives they construct to justify those choices, and the irreversible damage those choices leave behind. His story compels us to ask not only how such wars begin, but also how they might be prevented, and how those who have lived through them, on both sides, can find a way to heal. The cost of war, as Artem's life reveals, is measured not just in lives lost, but in the humanity eroded along the way. Artem Antonov's story is not unique, and that is what makes it so devastating. He is one of countless individuals swept up in a war they did not start but chose to sustain. His actions, like those of many others, were justified by the mantra of obedience, orders given and followed without question, their consequences ignored until it was too late. But obedience, stripped of morality, is not a virtue. It is a path that leads to destruction, not just of others, but of the self. This war, like so many before it, has shown the catastrophic cost of blind loyalty to unjust causes. Artem thought he was providing for his family, securing their future. Instead, he became part of a machine that destroyed the futures of countless others. His story is a mirror, reflecting the choices that ordinary people make when faced with extraordinary pressures, and the profound, often irreversible, impact of those choices. For the families left behind in the rubble, for the soldiers grappling with the weight of their actions, and for the countless lives lost, the cost of this war is immeasurable. It is a cost paid not just in blood, but in shattered trust, fractured communities, and the erosion of humanity itself. As we reflect on Artem's journey, we must ask ourselves, how do we, as individuals and as societies, prevent these tragedies from repeating? How do we confront the forces that drive us to war, and how do we hold those who perpetuate it accountable? Most importantly, how do we remember the human faces behind the statistics and headlines? The fathers, mothers, children, and soldiers whose lives are forever changed by conflict. The cost of following orders in an unjust war is a cost we all bear. It is paid in the loss of our shared humanity, the destruction of lives and livelihoods, and the endless cycles of pain and retribution that follow. Artem Antonov's story is not just a tale of one man's reckoning. It is a challenge to all of us to see war for what it truly is and to strive for a world where such stories no longer need to be told. What would you do if faced with the choice Artem Antonov made? Would you follow orders, telling yourself it's for the greater good, or would you refuse, knowing the risks to your safety and your family? These are not easy questions, and they rarely come with easy answers. But they are the questions that shape not just individual lives, but the fate of entire nations. Artem's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about obedience, morality, and the cost of complicity in unjust wars. It reminds us that the choices we make, whether to act or to stand by, echo far beyond ourselves. They shape the lives of those we love, the communities we belong to, and the history we leave behind. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what will define your choices? And what kind of world do you want those choices to create? The answers may not come easily, but they are worth seeking. Because in the end, it is through our decisions, big and small, that we write the story of our humanity.